Hello,
We're back again.
he's Shabazz.
He's Pete Marshall, and this is Cryptchat UK. What are we talking about today, Pete Marshall?
We're talking about the news from the European Space Agency around disability in space,
Oh
trying to
yeah,
get disabled astronauts.
yeah. So do you want to lay lay out the land then?
I mean, I suppose like I will start off with this. It, if you look at the BBC and the Guardian articles and the Bloomberg articles and most of them, they're generally being they're generally being pretty like this is a major landmark for disability rights. And I have to say they very often do quote the phrase "we're all equally disabled in space," which I do acknowledge. I kind of love that. But like it's kind of worth pointing out if you check the actual specifications around that are on the actual website, then basically they've gone they looked at they've got advice from the Paralympic Committee, and essentially the only kind of three groups of disabled people who can actually apply if you have one or no legs, if you have a short stature, or if you have one leg that's shorter or longer, I suppose, than the other. So honestly, like they have a very specific thing, and they don't really mention neurodiversity. They have a specific question around mental health where they say like everyone who goes into this has to be like cognitively and psychologically kind of competent, I think is their phrase. So that's a fairly vague phrase, but I assume that means no mental health conditions. In terms of like um in terms of neurodiversity, it's very vague. Um, so honestly, it would be nice to have some clarification on that one. Um, but yeah, basically, they seem to be like they're getting advice from the Paralympic Committee, and they very much seem to be like trying to um, they very much seem to be trying to get um, trying to come up with technologies to make space travel more accessible within. But yeah, they do seem to specifically say repeatedly that this is a very high risk project. Um, and I suppose the final thing to say is that honestly, like there was an interesting thing that they talked about that, and I think that this probably goes into more of what they're expecting to get out of this than anything else. That they said that they want to they they want to hire more disabled people for other roles, but I think they've been specifically told that like if they disabled people can't have any role, then like they're going to have a problem. And so I didn't so in some ways I guess that's not quite so optimistic as it's generally being presented in the media, but
I I think they call me cynical, but I think around this the key part to this is to, to me anyway. It seems like a cynical PR exercise where you get all these like diverse headlines, and like once you look into the detail, it's like, well, we'll only accept a certain kind of disability and a certain this and a certain that, and to some degree I can understand why, but I would just question as to why they they're pushing this now. Are they trying to make themselves relevant? But it seems a bit of tokenism. But in one of the articles, they say specifically saying they don't want to be tokenistic, but I think on the other hand they are being tokenistic.
I mean, I suppose there's probably like real talk. I'm not sure that, you know, they're not going to be they're not going to like strike a massive blow for disabled people's rights under any circumstances. This is an interesting kind of symbolic situation. And I do think that it's important that if you look at NASA and if you look at kind of Jeff Bezos and all of those kind of the capitalist space programs, generally they've always gone with a fairly blunt attitude that all disability is alike, and therefore if one disability can't be an astronaut, all disabilities can't be an astronaut. And I think that honestly this is at least an improvement on that. And hopefully if we can start presenting the argument that actually disabled people can go to space, so why can't, you know, why can't other jobs be made accessible? That is going to be a very good argument. I mean, and I would say that I think in some ways, I'm not sure what to think about the entire thing about getting disabled people into this is part of a larger scheme about getting more disabled people into other roles. Because on the one hand, I don't think there's ever, you know, they're asking for 6 people in total. I don't think there's ever going to be a situation in which, you know, half their astronauts are going to have disabilities, or even 30%. I would also point out though that most of the power in most of these situations is not held by astronauts. And in the end, getting more disabled mathematicians and getting more kind of nuclear physicists and getting more people in ground control roles, they're incredibly important too and make a lot of very important decisions. And they don't get most of the glory, but they deserve a lot more than they get. And so I think in that sense, like anyway, yeah.
I think it's also we in the disabled community and as a society need to have a debate around representation for representation's sake, you know, and whether this is part of that, we need to make sure that that isn't the case.
It's a complicated one in terms of whether this is a representation argument or whether this is a kind of workplace accessibility argument, because I suppose they could justifiably say, look, this job, you know, as much as these people are kind of spokesmen in various ways and do end up being celebrities, actually, like, they have a job to do. They're not celebrities. They're not Kim Kardashian. They're not kind of actors. Their job isn't to like, and so, you know, they have to be and so in that sense, like they could justifiably turn around and go, well, this isn't actually this isn't actually a representation argument, because like in the end, you know, X job has to get done. And in the same way as it's always been more or less acceptable to kind of firefighters, for example, you know, how many firefighters are in a wheelchair? You know, very few people argue that that's unjust. Again, I think actually there's an interesting argument around this, that actually with the technologies they're pioneering here, could there be more of an argument that firefighters, you know, the same thing with soldiers in the army, you know, many neurodiverse people aren't allowed to be soldiers in the army, and yet no one argues that that demonstrates poor representation, because, you know, again, whether they should is you know.
But I would like to bring this conversation back down to earth, really.
That sounds very boring.
And you know, and not have the ultimate trickle down effect is what you're kind of like saying this could be. Like these things happening in space could trickle down to earth. I mean, that is not going to happen, I don't think. What I think needs to happen is this to me is the equivalent of when your flush is broken in your house, instead of fixing your flush, you want to move house. You just like going, oh, I don't want to fix that flush. Let's just move into a new house. So this, although is a very interesting idea, and it gets in the press or whatever, and it gives the press an interesting story to talk about, because there are lots of other things that then depressing and boring, or whatever you want to call it. But the truth of the matter is that what we should be doing really is fixing the planet we have, and like making people's lives on Earth better first and foremost.
I mean,
And
that's. I mean, I if you're going with a climate change argument here, then I don't. I mean, I don't think this is part of a program to basically move all human beings to Mars. That's going to take a degree of time and effort, and I honestly like the European space program and everything. I doubt Europe is not bad around climate change,
no, I wasn't really
but
talking about climate change. Really, I was talking about actual, like, in material stuff like housing, like, social care, you know, all of the,
I mean, I will
food.
say, I will say, I don't disagree. You know, there are other much more important topics, and there are other topics that will have make much more of a difference. But I will say that let's say that you're talking about, I don't know, the mathematicians who calculate the trajectory of the space flight. Those are some of the most prestigious people in their respective roles. And if a disabled person, more disabled people get into those kind of roles, they're very well paid jobs. They're prestigious. They come from decent careers and go on to decent careers. I think that honestly, like this is in that sense, this is the small part. Talking about it just in terms of astronauts, I think, is a small part of a much larger um, discussion about how accessible many of the ground control roles are. Because honestly, there's no reason why they shouldn't be accessible. And if this is part of them hiring more people for those ground control roles with
Yeah,
disabilities, yada yada yada. And I also think that there's an entire discussion about that. This is one of the reasons why many other disabilities kind of basically had to be excluded in this context is the fact that many of the instruments that got used rely on high levels of dexterity. They rely on certain body shape. They rely on certain abilities with mobility and that kind of thing. In the end, I think actually one of the things that could very well be started to be shifted is all of those things. And in the end, there could also be discussions about mental health consequences of going to space. And if you're just basically going, who are the most mentally like indestructible people, and then basically sending them off to space and going like, meh, then by definition they will probably be the least kind of they will have the least whatever is thrown at them will probably have the least impact. Whereas actually like thinking about what other people's the impact from other people's perspectives, hopefully all of that kind of thing will have again a trickle down effect around like make it around allowing more people later on to be astronauts and more people to have more different types of roles and more people to have an impact on space travel.
yeah. Just so that you and everybody else knows, I'm not like totally against space or anything like that, and I don't recognize the real life applications. I'll just give you one example. The chair I'm sitting in all the time, the molded back seat, the technology was developed from NASA,
Mm.
you know, and the metals and all that kind of thing. All that. My molded back seat cushion is as an offshoot of NASA, so I do see there's a real life applications and all that kind of thing. But what I'm saying, in the current situation that we're all in as humanity, the idea that, you know, people just want to get up and leave, and like billionaires are spending their money, like instead of helping people on Earth, doing a great kind of arms race as to who could get to Mars the fastest. To me, just seems like mind-blowingly like wrong.
I mean, I think that there's a very different discussion about space travel. That right now, space travel is being used by 3 or 4 billionaires to essentially like
It's a dick measuring contest.
I was trying to come up with a different metaphor, but yes, basically like if you look at what they're doing, then I then honestly all, all of it, it's the equivalent. Have you ever seen the Easter Island heads?
No.
Well, basically, like there are these massive heads that are as tall as a one-story building, and basically, like this was built by people who, in Easter Island, one of the most isolated places on Earth, and basically this was a civilization that was in terminal collapse at the time, and basically, like they were cutting down the last of their trees to build more to build these heads. Um, and in the end they ended up by the time the Europeans got there was none left because basically they cut down all the trees, they damaged the ecosystem to a level that like. And so honestly, like if half of the money spent on all of these like on by Jeff Bezos and all that was spent on like climate change technology, then actually like a lot more of the problem would just be fixed, and a lot more of the complaints that come from places like from third world and second world countries, that when they say they're not getting the kind of support that they need to actually like go on to carbon neutral technologies, in the end, like there are people such as this who could basically just swivel wrist, give them a check, and then they could just get on with it. And in the end, that would basically solve a large section of these problems. And actually then we could start actually like the Paris Climate Agreement could actually be a lot more effective. But no, they choose to spend their money on space travel, and they use and that means that everyone else has far more work to get done. And that's an entirely different discussion about space. But I would say that I genuinely think that the European Space Agency is not in that category, arguably.
Yeah, but I would argue that they are kind of are, in terms of they're trying to like make themselves relevant, because there's they see people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos doing these programs, and then they're like, oh, we want to get ourselves in the news. How do we kind of get ourselves in the media? And like,
I mean, I would just say I think that you're overstating the importance of the media to most of these people. Real talk. If you're, for example, if you are a physicist in who is even slightly eminent in these areas, then basically you'll never get in the media. That's not a problem because they publish papers, they have their own networks, they have their own conferences. If in almost any of these jobs, they have their own kind of society of people. And in the end, getting into like the BBC is probably like the only time they expect to get on the BBC is if they're like working on Mars rover or something like that. And in the end, it's worth pointing out that like if you look at any of these space programs, they normally mention about 2 people. Now, I guarantee you that if you're launching a rocket, at least 50,000 people have worked on that.
yeah.
In various capacities. Like they are massive projects, and to mention 2 people is just ridiculously managerial. And it's just like, and honestly, like I there is a reason why people constantly talk about teamwork, because So I suspect that getting that in some ways, this is probably more about the fact that because of previous, again, one of the major inputs into this that is the Paralympic Games, and it's become a much harder argument to make that kind of some of the most like fittest people, some of the most competent people aren't disabled. In that sense, it's become harder, and they already have a group of people who basically already have to deal with kind of categorizing disabilities and things like that. So they basically have a great deal more to just take off peg, and they have a great deal of people who they can just who they can get to advise them. There's probably a massive thing about the fact that they want more disabled physicists who are genuinely amazingly competent. They want them to try to apply to them. In the end, like there's a, so I suspect it probably has more to do with getting the cream of the disabled community to apply to the European Space Agency, and it gives them some kudos. I suspect it has more to do with that if we're looking for cynical reasons why they're doing this than because but yeah.
Yeah, I just want to clarify. What I mean is they want to make themselves culturally relevant. Is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
They're not like desperate to get in the paper. They just want to make themselves. They just want to slightly update themselves and make themselves culturally relevant. And maybe a drive to do this is like, trying to get all those like super smart hackers to get in touch with them and all those kind of people. Maybe that's part of it.
I was amused when they didn't mention neurodiversity once.
Yeah.
And I suspect that that's because there is a lot of autistic people who are obsessed by math and space and computer programming and stuff. And B, they are very uncertain about whether those same people who are in the skill bracket they are talking about can actually pass the psychological exams.
Yeah.
And so they have a problem on their hands, that on the one hand they don't want that. And again, this is why they use the word disability in the most general sense, despite the fact that you look at their website and it very firmly narrows it down. But in the autistic community, there is probably loads of people who would love nothing more than to do some of those really important ground control jobs. But honestly, saying that autistic people could not be astronauts, whilst at the same time they're kind of in the back of their minds, they're like, disabled people very possibly couldn't be astronauts. Like the sheer so. Yeah, I mean it's an interest. Yeah.
Doesn't it remind you a bit about? God, I didn't think I'd be talking about him during this episode. But doesn't it remind you about Dominic Cummings' call for weirdos to apply to the civil service?
Well, I do think there's different coding in there. Like real talk, the coding that Dominic Cummings was using was he wanted basically right-wing kind of right-wingers, basically people who were rejected from the ordinary academic community and things like that. So I suspect that the coding he was very much using was not disabled, but like people who are like white middle-aged people who believe in eugenics, or who believe that I don't know, who use math to prove that Stonehenge is part of a larger ley line system. I don't know. He was using weird shit. He was trying to argue for that. This, again, I think it's probably a fair amount towards left wing and kind of more general kind of disability and feminist kudos.
Yeah, but do you really think they've sat there and they've thought, hang on, we're missing out on a load of untapped genius potential here?
They've probably thought that. But I suspect that applies mostly to the ground control teams and less to the astronauts.
Yeah.
Because I mean, real talk, if we're talking about like how do you like what are you doing in terms of if we're talking about an entire like space center, then honestly the astronauts are a relatively tiny part of that. And honestly, the astronauts are expected at all times to be in complete communication with ground control and to have teams of like 100 odd experts who do everything from computer programming to, and basically if a problem actually arises, then basically what you get is actually there's a very good Big Bang Theory episode where basically like where Howard Wolowitz, like the toilet backs up, and Howard Wolowitz and some of his friends get together in the flat and have to work out with like a plastic bucket full of stuff, like how they can actually fix this. And then like they spend all night doing that, and then they end up getting this thing to NASA, and then NASA calls it up to the astronauts. And so I suspect that in terms of the geniuses, you need geniuses in the on ground control. Like honestly, you need reliable workers and people who basically you can put in incredibly stressful situations and who can basically still go, hey, I need you to do this, that, and the other, and they will just go away and do it. Which again, that requires intelligence and computer programming skills, and they have to understand what they're doing in the context and everything. But when we're talking geniuses, you don't, honestly, they're not the astronauts aren't the people with the highest IQ in the entire of NASA, and they're not going to be in the ESA either or anywhere else.
If you just say for argument's sake, if you knew a neurodiverse genius, right? Would you recommend that they applied?
I mean, in many ways, it's hard to say no. In the sense that, like, honestly, I would say that if you're a genius, then ground control is going to be far more like doing one of the jobs there is going to be far more to most people's like, again, it's a far more creative job. It requires a lot more in terms of like, okay, we need to achieve this. How do we get from here to like firing a rocket? Like we need to get this experiment into like 6 square inches and have it weigh less than 4 grams. Like, and just get it done. Like it's a very creative, it's a very highly skilled, it's a pretty well paid. These are well paid positions we're talking about.
Yeah,
and it's very easy to get yourself a reputation. It's very easy to like be writing papers and to be like get your CV to burnish your CV.
I just think it'd be a very interesting like test case almost, to if somebody did like was neurodiverse and was a mathematical genius and did apply to this and what they would actually like come back with,
It would be interesting to see in terms of like I think astronaut versus ground control would probably be 2 very different discussions.
Yeah.
But yeah, it would be interesting in terms of yeah.
A workplace dispute would be kind of very like interesting in that sense.
Yeah, honestly, yeah, I think it would probably depend on the type of nerd culture that they had.
Yeah.
And I would be very curious to see what that would be like. It would depend, it would probably depend a lot more on managers and a lot more on kind of what their definitions around teamwork are and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I don't
because
know.
I was just thinking, like, what if, obviously it's not with us anymore, but what if somebody like of Stephen Hawking's intellect kind of applied for this, what would happen?
It would probably depend, especially if they were neurodiverse. Stephen Hawking wasn't neurodiverse. But
Yeah.
especially if they were neurodiverse, it would depend a lot more on, yeah, their ability to fit in with teams, and whether the projects they were told to work on kind of interested them, and whether they had a good or bad manager, and whether they ended up getting on. It would depend a lot more on those things.
Yeah.
I don't know. It would be interesting to hear from anyone who works in these places. I mean,
So if anybody is interested, I would say get in touch with us before you apply. Then we can follow your progress, and we can let
exactly.
everybody
We'd be
know.
fascinated to talk about it.
Yeah, because we'll help you with the process in any way we possibly can. We're probably not smart enough to do that.
We're definitely not smart enough. But
Yeah,
like,
but in terms of like following your journey, it'd be kind of interesting.
just to point out, you need a master's degree to
Yeah,
even and 3 years of postgrad experience to even apply.
yeah,
So that means that so that means that basically like that's most of your way to what it takes 4 years after your master's degree to have a doctorate.
yeah.
So like almost everyone who applies, you're basically talking about people who have doctorates in like.
And some of the criteria was a bit weird because it was like, what if one of your legs is shorter? And I was thinking, nobody's symmetrical anyway, right?
I mean, I suspect that this is part of this entire thing about they're thinking that if you have physical disabilities, that's pretty, then basically they can like give you like one of those like Blade Runner kind of limbs or something. Like
Yeah,
they can basically like, it's pretty in many of these situations, like if you have, yeah, if there's a technological fix, then they're completely enthusiastic about doing it. I suspect they're a lot less comfortable about, because especially I suspect one of the reasons why they're uncomfortable about mentioning the word neurodiversity in autism is that there tends to be issues around like especially if you're putting someone into a team and they have like 3 people in a team and they have to stay in the thing for 6 months. Like in the end that becomes a very kind of socially like
yeah,
stressful situation. like yeah, imagine that you were like on lockdown. Now imagine that you're like that for 6 months and you can't leave the entire
yeah.
place, and there's no, and so so as soon as you start talking about kind of and yeah, how would you deal, and yeah, as soon as you start getting those kind of minor disputes very rapidly escalate and things,
And
again I might point out that there's probably ways around this, but again they would probably say, look, we've already got this project that we're putting large amounts of money in that's like a high risk. We don't want to like increase the risk any higher, which I'm not sure I love that answer, but like I guess
and
one step at a time.
and yeah, but don't you think it's weird that uh and do you think it's actually good for disabled people to apply for this?
I mean, it's a job.
Yeah.
Like I would probably, the only thing I would say about this is that I'm not sure if you have a comfortable job, whether like this is a high risk position,
Yeah.
especially as most of the especially if you apply for an astronaut, let's go with that as a kind of current thing. If you have a if you have like, basically you're dealing with very, very high qualified people here. Like they probably won't find it massively difficult to get a job. Probably,
Yeah.
hopefully. And honestly, like it being a reserve astronaut is probably awesome, but I'm not sure like how that fits in with other jobs and other like responsibilities that you have. And what happens if you don't get called up for 2 years? You know,
I I don't and I don't think they're as well known as Paralympians, for example.
I mean,
Astronauts. And
it's interesting in terms of like, if you look at, it would be interesting to see how it affects other parts of their careers. that's certainly,
Yeah.
if and yeah.
Because I think if and when we do have Paralympians on the show, I think we should ask somebody what they think about this, because they're the group of people that have been asked
I
about
mean,
this.
I suspect it's only the very top that have had
Yeah.
discussions with the European Space Agency
Yeah.
and very specific like physiotherapists and
Yeah.
stuff. But broadly speaking, like it would be I think it'd be interesting to ask like how Paralympians felt their Paralympian career fitted in with kind of other sections of their life, because like for example, there's many Paralympic events that you can basically do until you're like 30, 40, blah blah blah. So in the end, like you have a life after that, and
Yeah.
yeah, it's
And
and how can you like what can you kind of what kind of links in well with your Paralympic experience? Like I don't know.
and would it be a good job for Oscar Pistorius now that he's under house arrest?
Well, I suppose I suppose they'd always know where he was,
Yeah.
especially if he was on like if he was on a space station, you wouldn't have to guard him up there. It would just be
Yeah.
like, well, there's one way on and one way off. So
Yeah. You don't have to tag him.
there's always going to be cameras on him at all times.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what his female colleagues would feel about like being on.
No, it'd have to be just him by himself.
Yeah, probably.
Him and his blades.
It might, yeah, it might also be a thing of like, I'm not sure how they'd feel about kind of, again, his tolerance to stress.
Yeah.
Because like, if he was up at like midnight and like saw a shape looming over him, we're like, oh my god, I have to shoot that thing or I might die.
Yeah.
That doesn't that
It's
that
just
doesn't
something that
demonstrate
occurred.
particularly good tolerance to stress.
Yeah, it's just something that occurred to me. I just thought I'd mention it. And just before we close, I'd just like to ask you if there's anything else you think we should be mentioning on this episode about wheels in space. I think this is going to be called.
Yeah, it's slightly disappointing actually that people in wheelchairs aren't going to be able to go.
No.
Again, like if nothing else, it ruins the title.
No, but it's weird because you're floating around in space anyway. So
Yeah, I suppose that's part of the discussion about like generally I suspect that their argument would be that again, high risk project, not sure how it's going to end. They want to minimize risks. I suspect that they're nervous about like about that kind of floating mobility kind of thing.
yeah.
And like would they need to build like spacesuits with wheelchairs attached, or like how would they if they were asked to like land on the moon, then how I don't know.
And what happens about space sex? These are just interesting questions for me anyway. Yeah, but about floating around is very weird, like thought, really, isn't it?
Yeah,
Is
and
it
honestly, it
or is it like
it would be interesting to dissect the kind of International Space Station, for example, in terms of how disability accessible it was architecturally speaking. Like again, I don't know if anyone's ever done this before, but like honestly, like I suspect as part of this project, they either have had or will have to basically go through it and be like, because I suppose if you're floating around in space and someone functionally can't control their legs, normally kind of if you look at people floating around, then it's kind of then they use their feet to kick off and they kind of do a kind of not quite swimming motion, but use their arms to like control them. So if you're so I suppose you could use your arms to do both hypothetically, but I don't know. But again, you could like that's
What-
basically architecture in terms of what's necessary there and what's
Okay, we've floated around in this episode, but in closing, it'd be boring and just appeal to people that are spending billions of pounds on or dollars on this to spend some of the money on Earth because we kind of need it. So I just had to close in that really, and I'd just like to say bye bye really, and may you rest in space.
See you everyone, have a good week, bye.
Bye bye.